So this afternoon, I'm going to be talking to you about the Bible and how we have our Bible as it is now. And I wanted to read these two verses for you at the beginning, starting with Genesis 3:1. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field, which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And then jumping forward to Psalm 11, verse 3, if the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? And so I think one thing that's important for us is to know that we can trust our Bibles, because this is the way that enemies of Christ have always attacked the church and have attacked, and that's through attacking the Bible, through making us doubt the Bible, and also hurting our evangelistic efforts, because if other people think that the Bible isn't trustworthy, they won't listen. Or if they hear, they might have a niggling doubt in the back of their mind that says, it doesn't matter, that's just some old book, it's not really trustworthy. And so that's one reason that we should look at where the Bible came from and how God saw fit for it to be given to us, and to understand that. So, just to go over some basics at the beginning, most of you probably know that the Bible is divided into the Old and New Testament. The Old Testament can be divided further. The first 5 books, in the Hebrew it's called the Torah. In other, I'm not sure what language this is even, I think it's Latin. It's called the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Both of those just mean 5. Then after that, the next division is the prophets, and that would be the historical books. So Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, those books, 1st and 2nd Kings, not Chronicles. Chronicles gets put into the 3rd category, which is the writings. Also, in the prophets would be the later prophets, so Jeremiah, Isaiah, the minor prophets, other major prophets. And then the reason that we call them the minor and major prophets is not because what they said was more important for the major prophets and less important for the minor prophets. It's just how long the books are. Jeremiah is very long. Isaiah is very long. Jonah is very short. That's the difference. Then the 3rd category is sort of the, calling it catch-all would be wrong, but it's the writings. There is a Hebrew term for that too. I can't remember how to say it, so you won't hear it. The writings would be Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Job, books like that they're not really, well, they're a bit different than the others. They're sometimes included with the prophets, but they tend to be written in a slightly different way. Then there's the New Testament. In the New Testament, the main division that can be made are the Gospels at the beginning, and then the epistles in the second part. The word epistle is just another word for a letter. Most of the epistles are the Pauline epistles, which means that Paul wrote them. Some of the epistles in the New Testament, we don't know who wrote them, though people will argue at length, as it doesn't say in some of them in the text. I don't think that's the biggest thing we should be doing. Then there's also the epistles from the other apostles, Peter, James, John, those ones. And then Revelation is also an epistle. It's kind of a compilation of epistles, really. And then there's Acts, which isn't really in either of those categories, but Acts is written to go with Luke as sort of a second part. In Luke, he tells about how he's setting out to write the beginning of what Christ did. And then Acts is the Acts of the Apostles, but there's also an implication of, it's a continuation of Jesus' work, but through the apostles. So then those are the broad categories for when the books are written, or rather, those are the broad categories of how they organize the books. Then there's some question about when books are written that for most of them it doesn't matter that much, in that we aren't told by God. God doesn't expressly tell us when the books are written. in a lot of cases, a surprising number of cases, he doesn't even tell us who wrote them. It isn't told in the text. Some of the books it does quite clearly tell, or there's a tradition, a biblically backed tradition on who the writer was. The first 5 books are mostly written by Moses. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy also records the death of Moses, so he probably didn't write that part down. He could have prophesied. It's not impossible. Then in the New Testament, the 4 gospel books are associated with the guys who wrote them. So Mark writes the book of Mark, etc. But then there are some parts in the Old Testament, especially, we don't know who really wrote them. There are some Psalms we don't know who wrote them, and we're not really necessarily sure who the author of Chronicles is. But again, we shouldn't worry about that. If it was extremely important to our salvation, God would have told us. And that's something we just need to keep in mind. If there's something you don't understand or doesn't make sense to you, we can still trust God and not worry about it. Now, there's some question about how the books were put into the Bible, or collected, or whatever term you want to use. Jesus gives us the principle of how that's done. He says, "My sheep hear my voice," and that gives us the principle of how we know what books are his, which is to say that the church at large throughout history will look at the different books that are put forward as being books from God, and over time, Christians will agree that these are really the words of God. Now, there are formal occasions where these are put together, but largely speaking, before the various councils where they, quote, decide what happens, people already knew, largely speaking, what books they were going, what books God had given to us as the church. There are some books that some people thought were to be part of the canon or part of the Bible that aren't included, but that was a minority opinion. Some books took a bit longer for people to understand that they were part of the Bible. The one that comes to mind in the Old Testament is Esther, because Esther is a little confusing to people. It never mentions the name of God in the book. So some people get confused. What's it doing in the Bible if it isn't talking about God? And then in the New Testament, the example that is usually given is Hebrews, because Hebrews, it doesn't say that Paul is the author in the text. And so some people are confused by that, not sure if it should be part of the canon. But over time, you read it and you hear God's speaking through it. You see his, it's just clearly God's word over time. And other Christians have realized that. There are councils where these are formally accepted by the church of that time. And then, what happens after this is, as the Catholic Church moves along, they become more, the nice way of saying it would be protective of the Bible. And there's an idea that you can't just give the Bible to anyone, because if you do, they'll come up with doctrines that aren't in agreement with the church. And they're kind of right, but not for good reasons. A lot of reasons people would come up with doctrines that didn't agree with what they were saying was they were saying things that were against the Bible, just rather clearly and rather openly. And so there's a hesitancy on their part to show people the Bible or let them read it in their own language, because if they did, they would see the error and people would talk about it. This is a trend that gets worse over time, but then it begins to reverse with a character named John Wycliffe, who lives, or Wycliffe, I'm not sure which one is the correct way to say it, I've heard both. He lives in the 1300s, late 1300s, and he does translation. Now, this isn't to say that the Bible was lost, it wasn't, but what tended to happen was you would have Latin translations, so only people who were educated to speak in Latin could read them. And that's a bit more than some people have let on. There were quite a number of people who could read Latin. It was the language of the educated. But ordinary people or serfs or peasants probably couldn't read it, couldn't afford it. So Wycliffe wanted everybody, in England to be able to read the Bible. And so he translates the Bible into English. One of the things he says is, I will cause that every plowboy in the field shall be able to read it. And then his translation is influential, and he influences, personally trains a number of other Continentals. And among the people who were influenced by him is a man named John Huss. John Huss lives in Bohemia, and he starts a similar Reformation, pre-Reformation movement, but ultimately he is killed by the Catholics and burned at the stake, which doesn't really solve their problem because his followers disagree with the Catholic Church still. They fight a war, they fight 5 wars, they win 5 wars.
Was it for that purpose that they burned him at the stake?
Partly because he was translating the Bible and not agreeing with them on a number of doctrines. One of the things they were fighting about specifically was when people took communion, were how you were supposed to take it. Specifically, the Catholic Church was saying only priests were eligible to take the wine, to drink. They were saying they were the only ones who were eligible, and he said, no, that's not biblical. And there were a number of other points, some that are bigger than that in some ways, but that became sort of the flagship thing they were arguing about, to the point that on the battle standards they had a goblet as like their symbol.
Really?
So, yeah. Then 100 years later, we have Martin Luther. Martin Luther is important for a number of reasons, but for our talk here, one of the main things he does is he translates the Bible into German. So he translates the New Testament in under a year, which is really fast, and he does it from Greek. When we were doing Greek at Bible College, and they told us that, he was doing it by hand, and just the rate he was doing it, that comparing it to how quickly we would translate something in class or for a tech, he was just on a whole other level. He was really quite a great scholar and translator, and his translation, in the next 20 years, he translates the Old Testament and a number of other things. He keeps working on it up until his death, or shortly before his death. Now, something I should point out, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, the Bible is obviously not written originally in English. The Old Testament is written mostly in Hebrew. There's a tiny bit in Daniel that's written in Aramaic, I think, and then the New Testament is mostly written, I think almost entirely written in Greek, Koine Greek, which means that if you study classical Greek or Homeric Greek, it's different than that. Koine Greek is sort of, after Alexander conquers the world, the language of Greece is sort of left with a bunch of non-Greek speakers, and they have to learn it, and then they just basically break it down to its simpler form to use in ordinary life. So one of the things that we were very glad about is that this happened because classical Greek has something like 8 cases of nouns. Koine Greek has 5, and you only really use 4 of them. So much easier to learn. And that's one reason probably that God used it, because it's a simpler way, it's very precise. You can understand directly what the author means in most cases, but it's not nearly as complicated as classical Greek. So anyway, we get back to Luther. So he translates the Bible. I think one way to look at how successful his translation was is to read one of his enemies, a guy named, I can't read his name. It's not English, I'm sorry. But a German humanist complained that Luther's New Testament was so much multiplied and spread that printers, by printers, that even tailors and shoemakers, yes, even women and ignorant persons who had accepted this new Lutheran gospel
in the same sentence?
Yep. And could read a little German, studied it with the greatest avidity as the fountain of all truth. Some committed it to memory and carried it about in their bosom. In a few months, such people deemed themselves so learned that they were not ashamed to dispute about faith and the gospel, not only with the Catholic laymen, but even with priests and monks and doctors of divinity. But why could they do that? Well, there's a verse in the Old Testament, I don't have it written here, but I think of it now, where he says, I'm wiser than my teachers because I've studied your law. the Roman Catholic training centers of the time, they did teach them useful things, their people, but they didn't teach them mostly to study the Bible. And so, of course, someone who's very excited to finally be able to read God's word in their own language is going to be able to pass that fairly quickly. Someone who's only casually or passingly studied it in another language, and one that they're probably not really accustomed to studying with. Back in England, about the same time, so this is the 1540s, 30s and 40s rather, we see the English reformer Tyndale at work, William Tyndale, translating the Bible. And then he got into an argument, and I rather like this line. So he said, "If God spares my life, I will take care that a plowboy shall know more of the scriptures than you do," talking to a Roman Catholic priest. And he largely succeeds. Now, he doesn't live to see his success. He has to flee the country, and then they smuggle in Bibles for a while. And that's interesting, but ultimately he's captured and then burned at the stake. But then his last words before he's killed, martyred, he says, "Oh God, please open the king's eyes." And then within 4 years, 4 English translations of the Bible were published in England at that same king's request, including Henry's official Great Bible. All of these are largely based on Tyndale's work. And so this is in the 1540s. There are a number of other English Bibles that are published throughout the 1500s. And then in 1611, the King James Version is published, which, according to some analyses, I've heard higher numbers, but according to some, it's 70% reliant on Tyndale's work. Now, again, what that means is they'll take a Greek passage, and then they'll translate it into English, and then they'll consult, Tyndale or other translators to see what they've done. Because whenever you do translation work, there is always a worry, like, did I get this? Am I the first person to get this way of translating something? You don't really want to do that necessarily. It might be that everyone else has gotten it wrong or has a slightly different inflection they're bringing out, but that would be why they would be using him. So then later translations, there have been a bunch of them since 1611. And then the term, I was taught in college, there's sort of 2 schools of thought on how you do a translation. One is a dynamic translation, and the other is formal equivalent. Antagonistically called a wooden translation. That's the one I remembered. I had actually forgotten the formal equivalent was the correct term until I did my notes. So dynamic translations try to find, they'll look at the text, and then if there's an expression, they'll try to find an equivalent English expression or whatever language you're translating into, and then put that expression instead, so that it sounds nicer to an English ear, or whatever language you're translating to. A formal equivalent, or wooden, or literal, or however you want to say it, one of those ones would focus on, these are the words that are said, I'm going to try to get the exact same words over into the new language I'm going for. Different schools of thought go in different directions. There's a further kind of thing, like the more extreme version of a dynamic, which is just a paraphrase. Usually what happens for a paraphrase is someone will take an English translation and then just try to say it in easier words. So an example of that would be the Message Bible. And there's a number of those. One advantage we have in English is a lot of people have cared about the Bible enough to try and do it. And by do it, I mean do a translation of it. And so you can compare and see what different people have done. And because I remember talking to someone about this and talking about how useful it was to go into the Greek and Hebrew, and they said, well, what's the point of reading in English if I can't see that for myself, if this is so much better? And that really stumped me for a time. But really, that's not what God has called us to do. He hasn't called us all to be scholars of the original languages. And we can get a pretty good idea of what they're saying by just looking at a number of translations, and you can see how different people have translated it for your language. In our case, that's English. But I mean, largely it's the same. now. And I do think it's interesting. There have been a number of occasions where different secular leaders have tried to keep the Bible from Christians and from people in general. Each time, those institutions have failed either to keep the Bible or they've just fallen apart. Rather famously, when the communists were in charge in Russia, they tried to keep the Bible out. And what happened? It became such a prized commodity that they were one of the most valuable things you could smuggle in, if you were just smuggling for money, not just like, there were Christians who were trying to bring Bibles in for free, but there were other people who were, this is a hot commodity.
Yeah.
I'm going to make some money, you know. And then ultimately, you know, the Soviet Union would fail, and now the Bible is more available in Russia than it was then. I mean, I do think the classic example is Tyndale. Even though the king will kill him for what he's done, within a year the king is forced to change his position. And Tyndale's dying request that God open the king's eyes is answered, majorly changing England and opening the way for greater Reformation in England. That's the end of my notes. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
I remember when it wasn't too long ago that the smuggling into Russia wasn't, I mean, probably within the last 40 years.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you heard that, like the Bible that we read today, where you've got the 1611 controversy, you know, this Bible or no Bible only, that our Bible that we read really was not printed in 1611, it was later than that.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of argument about that. It is true that there have been a number of revisions in the King James Bible that are still called the 1611. They're not. The latest one was in 1795, so shortly after the American Revolution. But then there isn't one for about something like 100 years. And then when a team tried to do the new King James, for one thing, they used slightly different sources, which is one reason there was quite a bit of disagreement. And then another is nothing had happened for about 100 years on that specific front, which was one reason people were so surprised by it. Does that answer your question? Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So the time period that you're talking about with Tisdale, is that before Henry VIII?
That is Henry VIII. Henry
Okay,
VIII
that
is
period.
in charge.
Okay, so he's the king that you're talking about?
Yeah. And so, yeah, Henry VIII has an interesting relationship with, well, everything. I mean, his interests are primarily to see England as its own thing, and one of the great powers of Europe. And so to do that, he's willing to do a lot of things, and some of those things are good, and some of those are bad, and some of those have very good effects. But also he does persecute other Christians because he doesn't like them. Like he's not like Martin Luther, primarily acting out of conscience. I mean, rather amusingly, he actually wrote an early rebuttal to Luther, and so the popes named the English, gave him another title called the Defender of the Faith, which the English monarchs still use today, even though Henry VIII would go on to break away from the Catholics for mixed reasons. Yeah.
So that's starting the Church of England at that point?
There is a more conscientious group in the Church of England when they start that are not just acting out of getting power for themselves. But I'd say it's rather undeniable that King Henry VIII has mixed motives.
Yes.
How long do we keep questions going for?
run out of
So
questions.
nobody's-
Okay.
Do you, is there any, have you come across anything, like there are so many different versions right now, outside of King James, New King James, NIV, ESV. Are they, do you know, have you come across any reasons, like, do they state reasons why they continue to do new versions? Are they, what are they copying? Or what are they coming from?
Well, one of the things is they're from different groups. So, for example, a rather recent one, when I was looking through a list today, was from like 2018. It was supposed to be a revised one for the Catholics. So what you tend to see is denominational Bibles, where they'll go through and, using the sources, they'll translate just, how would I say it?
Words that accommodate their denomination,
Yeah.
like Jehovah's Witnesses.
Well, no, the Jehovah's Witnesses go further because they'll take words out or just not translate. They'll choose a word specifically. I don't think the Catholics do that specifically, though the Catholics do include the Apocrypha as part of the canon, or like between the Testaments. So that, that's different. Yeah, a lot of times it'll be a specific group will think that, either they'll think the current translations haven't quite taken advantage of some document. One thing to keep in mind is we found more fragments and earlier fragments since the 1500s. And so that's one reason that people will do that. They'll say, well, I want to take advantage of these new fragments. And it's not just like one or two. We have over 100,000 from various sources, which for comparison, we only have 12, not even primary documents, but the closest things we can get to primary documents on, say, Caesar. His campaigns, his autobiographical campaigns, there's only 12 copies of those. The earliest is from the 900s. That's 900 years after he lived, close to 1,000 years after he was born. That's a significant amount of time later for potential error to creep in. Whereas our earliest texts, from the Bible, some of the fragments, of various letters and epistles would be from, say, 150, which is really early. Again, given the fact that this was 2,000 years ago, and most of the time they're going to be writing on papyrus scrolls, and those don't have very good longevity. But some of them have lasted 2,000 years. So, I say they don't have good longevity comparatively, so, yeah.
I think the good example there was the Jehovah's Witness Bible. They intentionally did another one to say something that.
Yeah, they changed some of the verses. Now, they could get all of them because they're not very good at their job,
Right.
but like they'll take I think it's John 1:1, where it says the word became, word became, yeah, they say the word was a God. So they'll do things like that. And then to just basically try and prove their points. But they just have to lie to do so. And the thing is that they still haven't got all the verses that talk about Jesus is God, because they're not very good at it. And also, there are a lot of verses that talk about it. So, yeah.
The denominational Bibles, now, I'm thinking of the gay rights.
Mhm.
Now, do they change?
I don't know of a Bible yet that they try for that. There have been, what?
TNIV, that's,
Did
they
you
try
say
to
TNIV?
emasculate it.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, the TNIV was the people who did the NIV or were related to that, they took it and they changed all instances in the Bible, or a lot of instances in the Bible where it said he, and they put he or she,
Oh,
which is not quite making it homosexual or something, but they were trying to conform to the culture. But nobody really liked that because it's very clunky. to actually read that out loud, because there's a lot of cases where it'll say, he did this, he did this, he did this, and then to change it to he or she, it's not correct. The Old English way of writing something, when they say he, it can actually mean he and she, and that's correct, that's grammatically sound, and it's much easier to read than, and also it's closer to the Hebrew or to the Greek.
Like man sometimes is referring to just humankind.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah. And you'll get that where some of the translations, they do bend to societal pressure, and they'll change something specifically because of some fad that's going around, political fad or something. So like no, it's not quite fair to pick on this as a matter of translation, but the message will change. Romans 13 from saying the government does not, or rather, the exact wording escapes me, but something like the government does not bear the sword in vain. They change it to they don't wear their uniforms for nothing. Well, that's not really acceptable, because when it says the sword in vain, the sword has a very specific use in the Bible. That's talking about, use in war, use in capital punishment. Those are uses that can be taught rightly from that verse. Whereas just saying uniforms, well, I mean, Socrates wear uniforms. That doesn't give them the right to kill people, So, yeah. Yeah, and this is a topic that people can get very heated on, for good reason, because the Bible, Jesus does say that not one jot or one tittle of the law will fall away. So it's not just needless argument, but some people do argue very incorrectly on this, shall we say. Yeah. Other question? Yes, ma'am.
I think it's Mark. No, it's Luke 23. At the end of it, when Jesus is on the cross with the thief. And it's been told to me by other denominations that the placement of the comma before Jesus instead of after Jesus takes a whole different meaning of that sentence. So it's verse 42 and 43, and he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, truly, I say to you, comma, today you will be with me in paradise. But a friend of mine told me that the comma should be after the word today, and that changes the whole meaning of the sentence, meaning that you can lose your salvation.
But that would be a contradiction. Sorry, Tim.
Well,
I agree with you.
I won't get into the issue theologically, at least not at first. There's a simpler answer. The simpler answer is Greek doesn't have our punctuation marks. So whenever you have punctuation, that means it was added by the translators to make it understandable for English. And one reason that's kind of important is whenever people try to translate the Pauline epistles, Paul doesn't write short sentences, he writes paragraphs. And we're not really sure where the paragraphs will end. So you just try to find where he has like enough verbs and nouns and, all right, there's a sentence, there's one. You can still get, generally speaking, what they're going for. Sorry, what verse again?
It's verse 42 and 43.
Okay.
Luke 23. To base it on a comma that isn't there in the Greek seems a bit too far. But yeah, what were you planning to say?
Well, she knew what I was going to say when I spit it out there. But I think even the point there that so one of the things that pastors always whether he's taught us it from the pulpit or in our conversations, that if it's go with what you know to be true from Scripture. When something's a little off, like for instance, that says, "So verily I say unto you today," that doesn't even make any. I mean, I understand what you could be saying there.
Yes.
But that wouldn't even make any sense to say, because he's saying it to him today. He's talking to him right then
Right,
and
it
there.
doesn't, does it?
I mean, that's the way I see that,
Yeah.
but,
Well, I mean, he could be saying that, verily I say to you today. So that's kind of a double assurance, if you will, like, you know, verily, that's an assurance. And then I say to you, and then today, kind of a triple assurance, and then he makes the point that he's going to make next. You will be with me in paradise. That even if you do that grammatically, that isn't a very strong argument on eternal security one way or another. Yeah,
One more question. Isn't there gonna be a movie today?
there is. What time? What time does that start?
Family.
as soon as
I
Andy
said
hits the
one
red
more.
button.
Okay.
As soon as Sandy hits the red button.
There you
All right. Should I escape now?
Yes, you're,
Thank
thank you, Ted, thank you.